There, released my mummy video, as up to date as it can possibly be. Boy, I sure hope that Universal doesn't ironically put out any more mummy content in the next couple of days, camera that for some reason is turned on next to me.
She will not stop until she has remade our world.
God damn it. Wonder who Russell Crowe's playing. Dr. Jekyll. Say! Hello and welcome to Featured Creatures, where we look at many different adaptations of a single specific movie monster to see how they grow and change over time. Today, we're looking at the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Because, I mean, there can't be that many adaptations, right? Yeah, we're gonna need to cut this down a bit. Published in 1886, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is considered a seminal work in horror literature. It tells of Dr. Henry Jekyll, a man whose experiments creates his evil alter ego, Mr. Edward Hyde. But let's be perfectly honest here, it isn't very good. The story is told by Utterson, a lawyer who witnesses the events of Dr. Jekyll's story, but mostly second-hand. We never really see anything as it happens, and mixed with the verbose language of the period, it makes for a fairly boring read. But hey, at least it's short. The book comes in at a staggering 65 pages. Yet, even though I didn't particularly enjoy this, I can see why it became as well known as it did. The idea of a man being split into two halves, good and evil, is so unique and interesting that it could only ever capture people's imaginations. And as we all know, when a book manages to do that, it's only a matter of time before Hollywood gets their greasy paws on it. So, to be clear, there are so many different adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde that I couldn't possibly talk about all of them in one video, unless you want to sit watching me talk about this for 2 hours. And no one wants that. No one. So, to make things easier for myself, I've limited myself to a select few choices which I'm breaking down into categories. And who knows, maybe I'll even revisit The Strange Case at some later date to do some more. While there were several silent film versions of the story, the earliest being in 1908, we're going to start in 1920 with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Directed by John S. Robertson and starring John Barrymore as both Jekyll and Hyde, this film follows most of the ideas of the story, but not really the specific events, taking its lead from an 1887 play adaptation. Though weirdly, the earlier parts of the film seem to have more in common with the picture of Dorian Gray than Jekyll and Hyde. We see the young, pure heart of Dr. Jekyll tempted into sin after being taken to a music hall by an older nobility figure. Only here, instead of a Faustian arrangement with a portrait, Jekyll's desire to explore his sin leads him to creating the Hyde potion. It's an interesting take on the origins of Jekyll's transformation. In the novella, he did it to suppress the evil urges he felt, whereas here, he does it to experience them fully. I like this as a take because it makes Jekyll a bit less innocent and blurs the lines a bit more. However, the film itself isn't all that great. Just kind of in that standard non-comedy silent film way. It's a touch dull, there's some unintentionally funny moments, and the score is fairly headache-inducing, so not really one for me. While there were more silent film adaptations, we're next going to move into the talkies, with the 1931 film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And yes, I said Jekyll, because that's how it's pronounced here, and how it was originally meant to be pronounced. This film is the first talking version of the story. It follows a similar plot to the silent version, with the fiancé and a music hall plot, but it doesn't keep the stuff lifted from Dorian Gray. Frederick March plays both Jekyll and Hyde, and does a pretty good job as both. He captures the good nature of Jekyll while not making him boring, and makes his Hyde plenty menacing, while still keeping an entertaining energy to it. The most interesting aspect of this film is the juxtaposition of the relationships between Jekyll and his fiancée, and Hyde and this girl from the music hall. With Jekyll, it's all very sweet and charming, and the two have some nice chemistry, but for Hyde, it's abusive and worrying. Miriam Hopkins really sells the fear and revulsion in these scenes, and it's surprisingly salacious for the time. I mean, there's one point where you even see her bare knees. Oh, scandalous. The effects on the transformation are pretty good, though I find the most interesting one to be the first, where you don't see anything because it goes into this weird swirling image, where we see everything running through Jekyll and Hyde's mind. It's a good bit of filmmaking that still captures the imagination, even if the Hyde makeup does look incredibly goofy. As a whole, this one stands up. The acting is good, the visuals are good, and it has a surprising amount of depth for the time. In 1941 there was a remake of this starring Spencer Tracy as Jekyll and Hyde, but it's one I honestly don't see the point in. It's more or less beat for beat the same thing. It starts out a bit differently with some decent discussions about the nature of good and evil, but then it becomes just a less good copy of the earlier film. The least interesting thing here is the transformation into Hyde, where honestly, it's kind of hard to notice. I could barely tell the difference between the two. Maybe his eyebrows and hair are a little bit different, but that's kind of it. Though the transformations do have these wonderfully weird dreamlike visions, they're kind of frightening and cool. By and large though, this one isn't great. Just a remake for no reason that almost erased the good movie from existence. They tried to have all copies of the original destroyed so that people wouldn't compare them, like I'm doing right now. So that didn't work out too well for them, eh? Next up, we have 1951's The Son of Dr. Jekyll. Not really a sequel to any specific film, this tells the story of Dr. Jekyll's son Edward, 30 years after the events of the original. It is not all that interesting. For one thing, no one changes into Mr. Hyde in this. It's more about questioning whether or not it's in its head, but it's actually just someone framing him for the murders, and it's just kind of boring. I'd not recommend checking this one out, really. But all of these are a bit serious, so why don't we look at some versions of the story with a more humorous bent? Now, it's only natural when something becomes as popular as Jekyll and Hyde for people to want to make fun of it, and there's no shortage of films that play on the idea. The first was 1925's Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, starring Stan Laurel, a couple of years before he would team up with Oliver Hardy. It's only 20 minutes long, so as you might expect it's very simplistic. The transformation into Mr. Pride is more or less just a wig, and most of what he does really just amounts to pranks. In fact, the only truly evil thing he does is steals an ice cream cone. That simply cannot be forgiven. But yeah, it's a fun little short. Stan Laurel does a lot of good physical comedy, and even though it doesn't really have an ending, it's still one I'd say I enjoyed. For the next film on our list, we go back to our old friends Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. With Abbott and Costello meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here, Bud and Lou are a pair of 5 police officers who try to track down the mysterious killer stalking London streets. But, you know, turns out it's Jekyll and Hyde. This is about as silly as you'd expect. You get fun chases with Mr. Hyde, Costello does his usual breathless terror thing and ends up running around as Mr. Hyde-style monster himself. There's a suffragette musical number where they do the can-can. What?
Equal rights for the women. We're practically brimming over with our fight to get the vote.
Well, I'll be. That's definitely a thing someone put into a movie. I mean, how can I ever be expected to forgive this nonsense?
Either the effect of the serum takes too long to wear off, or it isn't long enough.
Boris. Yes, Frankenstein's monster himself, Boris Karloff, plays Jekyll and Hyde, in the only time that Universal did the character in their classic Monsters line. He plays it perfectly straight, really putting a gravity into the part. It's kind of bizarre to see such a serious performance in a movie that's so deliberately not. But it works. The man could do no wrong. A common way to parody a story is to take the ideas of it and put them into a new context. This can let you set a lighter tone and change the themes overall. Such is the case with the 1963 film The Nutty Professor and its 1996 remake. The original tells the story of Professor Julius Kelp, played by Jerry Lewis, who you might charitably call a bit of a schlemiel. After he develops an attraction for one of his students, not okay, he creates a potion that turns him into the sophisticated and cool Buddy Love. Buddy is pretty successful at seducing the girl, but the problem? He's also kind of a jerk. He's a misogynist, plain and simple, and it really doesn't help me enjoy the film. There are some fun moments, like when he's at the gym, or when to escape her seeing him transform, he does this. And when he first transforms, he actually briefly turns into a monster. That's kind of fun. But overall, this is overly long and fairly dull, with the main characters being highly unlikable. The remake, however, is a lot more fun. Eddie Murphy plays Sherman Klump, who is tremendously fat. He wants to impress a graduate student, a little better, and to lose weight. So he makes a potion that once again turns him into Buddy Love. Buddy here is more likeable, which makes his villainous stuff later on more interesting to see, and there's a much better actual story to this film. It's still not great and definitely starting to show its age nowadays, but it's at least the better of the two. But the big screen isn't the only place where Jekyll and Hyde have been adapted. They've also had their fair share of appearances on TV. In 1980 there was a made-for-TV movie, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring David Hemmings. No, I've never heard of him either. This is a pretty mediocre production. The pacing is ridiculously slow, and it feels as though it had the budget of maybe one episode of Tales of the Unexpected. But through all that, David Hemmings makes an excellent Mr. Hyde. Anytime he gets to be intimidating or creepy, he was utterly captivating to watch. The difference between Jekyll and Hyde here mainly seems to be age. Jekyll is old and has ridiculous facial hair, but Hyde is young and handsome. It makes it a bit more credible that people will be so taken in by him before he gives into cruelty against them. So that's interesting at least. Overall though, this is so slow and boring. Its low budget and terrible supporting actors really hold it back. Just a bit too dull for me. Slightly better was the 1990 version starring Michael Caine. It doesn't do much new with the story, admittedly, but the acting is better, with some nice supporting roles by Ronald Pickup and David Schofield, and it's a lot better paced than the 80s one. Still not great, but at least it isn't boring. Caine is as solid a lead as you'd expect. His Jekyll is likeable and human, and he sells a lot of the more emotional moments pretty decently, though it does sometimes range into the exquisite.
Help me! Somebody please help me!
His Hyde, though? That's where things get a little odd. I mean, just look at him. He's weird. The makeup is kind of meh and looks pretty silly, especially when he's meant to be intimidating. What's more interesting with his Hyde is that he almost never speaks. Most of the others get to have speeches, but this one just kind of growls until a few lines near the end. I'm honestly not sure if that was a smart choice or not. It sometimes comes across as creepy, but most of the time it's hard not to find it silly. And from a Mr. Hyde who never speaks, we go to a Mr. Hyde who never shuts up, with the 2007 BBC series Jekyll. This show tells the story of Dr. Tom Jackman, played by James Nesbitt, a descendant of the original Dr. Jekyll. He has started to turn into Mr. Hyde, but with no potion involved, and the two have worked out an agreement. They share the body, scheduling the changes and communicating with the dictaphone. But Dr. Jackman has a secret, a wife and 2 children that he doesn't want Hyde anywhere near. But when a mysterious agency starts to move in after Mr. Hyde, the two will be pushed to their limits to survive. This is a fun little series. There's action, intrigue, horror and comedy. It takes the premise and works it into the modern day of, wow, 10 years ago. Okay, I'm old. It never got a second series. I don't think that many people watched it, and it has plenty of issues, but I like it. Primarily for one reason. Mr. Hyde. James Nesbitt's Hyde is an absolute delight. Charming, funny, scary. He's like a child experienced in the world all new, but with the desires and drives of a grown man. He milks every second he's on screen for all it's worth, and it is glorious. This is honestly the Hyde by which I judge all Hydes, and most come up short. I genuinely recommend watching this series, just so you can see the scenes with him. I mean, he kills a lion and then sings the tokens. What's not to love? Jekyll and Hyde would be used as the basis for a TV show again in 2013 with the series Do No Harm. Here we have Dr. Jeremy something or other. Cole? I think it's Cole. He's a surgeon who at the same time every night changes personality into the evil Ian something. I don't even know the name on this one. And I only know he's called Ian because a handy hashtag is on the screen to tell me. Thanks, TV Rip. I mean, legally purchased copy of the DVD. Yeah, that's it. There's not even really that much of a noticeable change between the two sides, which makes it look more like dissociative identity disorder, which is more difficult to say than you might think. This is essentially a procedural medical drama, but with Jekyll and Hyde, like how House was a Sherlock Holmes equivalent of that, but this doesn't have nearly the charm of House. I only watched one episode, so maybe it gets better, but nah, not into this. So, from the versions put out there on TV, made to appeal to the widest audiences possible, let's move on to something a bit more schlocky. Yes, exploitation films, the cheapest of the cheap, made on a shoestring budget and generally looking like it. Jekyll and Hyde is no stranger to this kind of film. In 1971, the eternally low-budget Hammer Horror made I'm Monster. This is a fairly faithful telling of the story, but with the weird decision to rename the main characters Dr. Marlowe and Mr. Blake. Why bother? Everyone else has the same name, so why change the main guy? I mean, how am I expected to forgive this?
Would you be willing to try something, the result of which cannot be predicted, but which I believe, sincerely, will be of considerable help to us both?
Christopher! Yes, Christopher Lee plays Marlowe and Blake, and he is excellent in both parts, really capturing the suave and restrained nature contrasted with the enjoyable villainy. There's a reason he played as many movie monsters as he did. He's an intimidating guy, but he brings a pathos to the role too. I wouldn't really recommend this movie as a whole. It's a bit dull and not much goes on, but his performance is excellent, so that's something at least. In 1976, there was the film Dr. Black, Mr. Hyde, a blaxploitation film from the director William Crane, fresh on the heels of his success with Blackula. Here we have Henry Pride, a doctor who experiments with a drug to potentially cure cirrhosis of the liver, but when he tests it on himself, oh no. It turns him white. Yep, whiteface. I would feel out of my depth talking about the complicated politics surrounding something like this, so I'm just going to take a pass on this particular aspect of the film, thanks. Other than that one thing, which I'm not touching with a 20-foot pole, this is a fairly standard exploitation film. Incredibly cheap, bad acting, dialogue that sounds like it was recorded on a potato, you know the kind of thing. There's a few moments that got a laugh out of me though, like anytime he gets into a fight as Mr. Hyde and the funky score kicks in. But yeah, I think we can look past this one. Back over to Hammer Horror for the next one, 1971's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Here, Dr. Jekyll, played by Ralph Bates, is trying to create an elixir of life from female hormones. The potion that he creates has the ability to extend life, but it comes with the side effect of turning him into a woman. The titular Sister Hyde, played by Martine Beswick. To get enough of a supply of female hormones, he has to surgically remove organs from corpses. First, he gets them supplied by Burke and Hare, but when they're removed from the picture, he becomes Jack the Ripper to continue the habit. This is a good little film. I wasn't expecting much from it and was pleasantly surprised. The plot has just enough twists and turns to keep you entertained, the acting is decent for a Hammer film, and there's some nice dark moments to be had here. Sister Hyde has some intimidating moments and gets her fair share of the murdering. Martine Beswick was clearly having some fun and it works. What I like is that during the first transformation, there's a brief moment where it's actually hard to tell there's been a change. The two look just enough alike that you can really buy into the idea. I enjoyed this one. But this wasn't the only time they tried this premise. In 1995 we got Dr. Jekyll and Miss Hyde. This one isn't so much an exploitation film as is a wacky comedy. But where else am I meant to put this? In the only a parody section? Come on. Here, Tim Daly plays Dr. Richard Jacks, who makes a potion or something that turns him into Miss Helen Hyde, played by Sean Young. They work in a perfume production company, and Helen seduces her way to the top, I guess. This isn't very good. I mean, the main cast are all fine, but the plot isn't very interesting, and honestly, it does a lot to objectify Miss Hyde. Weirdly, more than the 70s Hammer Horror one. Why is the movie from 24 years later less female positive? Bah! Now, we've seen what happens when the good doctor and his alter ego are the main focus of the story, but what happens when they take on a more supporting role? There would be several times when Jekyll and Hyde would be put in a story as part of a larger ensemble. It's not a bad idea. You get both the genius chemist of Jekyll and the brute strength of Mr. Hyde. Can't think of anyone in any other super team who fits that profile. In 1999, writer Alan Moore and artist Kevin O'Neill created the comic book The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a play on the concept of the superhero team and the greatest Victorian literature fanfic ever. The League consists of characters from famous British fiction. There's Mina Murray, Alan Quatermain, Captain Nemo, the Invisible Man, and of course, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Hyde is the highlight of this series. He is Dr. Jekyll's sin made flesh, and as such he began life as a dwarf before, being left untethered, he grew. He's a huge, hulking monster, utterly terrifying to look at, but capable of humanity when Mina is involved. He sees that she isn't scared of him, and he wants to protect her. Not that she needs it, she is fierce. There are so many great moments with him in this book. None more epic than when he single-handedly takes down a Martian tripod. This is a great comic with seriously compelling story, wonderful action, and intelligent takes on the ideas and characters used. I would recommend it to anyone without hesitation. So how could anyone possibly ruin this? Yeah. The comic was adapted into a movie in 2003, and to put it delicately, it is bad. To put it less delicately, it's an absolute dumpster fire of a film that misunderstands everything that made the source material good, adding in characters for no reason and not even knowing how Dorian Gray's portrait works. I'm sorry. I'll calm down. Jekyll and Hyde are the one aspect of this film I kind of like. Jason Fleming does a good job with both parts, and the interesting thing? They talk to each other, appearing in reflections. At first, so Hyde can try to be let free, but later on, so they can work together. The villains make a copy of his potion and create an enormous, terrible CGI Hyde. It's pretty awful, especially when you compare it to the honest-to-God practical makeup for the real Hyde, which actually looks good. It is the only thing in this movie that looks good. Mr. Hyde appeared briefly as a supporting character in 2004's Van Helsing. Here, he's a pretty big guy. Not quite League big, but towering over Hugh Jackman. He's not in the thing for very long, but has a lot of personality, despite the not especially good CGI. He serves the purpose of establishing how Van Helsing fights monsters, and then quickly dies via his own stupidity, turning back into a very confused-looking Dr. Jekyll along the way. Dr. Jekyll, played by Russell Crowe, is a supporting character in The New Mummy, which is starting out and possibly already burying the Universal Monsters Dark Universe. Here, he's essentially the Nick Fury of the movie, having a team put together to capture monsters. It's a lot less cool than it should be. He does turn into Mr. Hyde. Basically, they just turn his skin grey and he gets a Cockney accent. I don't think they should have had Hyde in this movie. A small hint would have been enough, since we're only there to see the mummy. He's basically just a distraction to the main event. But that's hardly the only problem with this movie.
Oh, trust me. I'll get back to this one.
As it stands, I kind of enjoyed Dick Van Dyke Cockney Mr. Hyde, but just because it's so ridiculous. So, whatever. So, that's Jekyll and Hyde. We managed to cover a lot of stuff here, and I think we did pretty well not to miss anything too glaring, but... Say, what's this elephant in the room? And yes, I know technically it's actually a mammoth, but it's the best I could find. Oh, that. Yeah, there's musical versions of this story. More than one for some reason. The first was in 1973, starring Kirk Douglas as a Canadian Dr. Jekyll, presumably because Kirk Douglas couldn't do an accent. And this is... wow. I mean, just... look at it. It's so bad there was never even a DVD release. The songs are so awful, they make Scrooge look like Oliver in comparison. The performances are pretty terrible across the board, and it's just so dumb. I mean, there's a song just about Dr. Jekyll having bought a bike.
What have you done?
I bought a bicycle.
Bought a bicycle?
Yes, bought a bicycle. I bought a bicycle.
Mr. Hyde is kind of goofy. It's clear Kirk Douglas is having a lot of fun with the part, but it isn't good. It's very difficult to find him menacing when he acts like this.
Sylphie in the Grand Ballet.
So yeah, not great. But I'm sure they couldn't cast anyone worse as Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive.
Oh, good. Yes, The Hoff starred in a musical version of Jekyll and Hyde back in 2000. It was originally on Broadway in 1997, but the version with the Hoff is the only recorded version. And it is... not great. I mean, it's a hell of a lot better than the Kirk Douglas one, but it's pretty boring and feels very low energy. But the Hoff does sing a duet with himself by flipping his hair back and forth, so there's that. And as it stands, his singing is okay. I mean, he can sing. But his voice is just not right for this kind of song. So, it's not that good, but I guess it's the best we're going to get. So, Jekyll and Hyde have had something of a mixed bag over their history. The idea is a genuinely brilliant one, but the execution is often fairly boring. I find the best of them are usually the ones where they stray further from the original plot and do more interesting things, like Sister Hyde, the comedies, and Jekyll. But even with all the versions I've watched, there are so many more out there, like I didn't do the most recent TV version, I'm sorry, please don't hate me. It's a story we show no signs of getting sick of, and much as I'm going to be avoiding the characters for a while after overdosing on them like this, I'll definitely be interested to see what new ways we explore these two fascinating characters in the future. So, until next time, this has been Featured Creatures.
What have you done?
I bought a bicycle.
Bought a bicycle?
Yes, bought a bicycle. I bought a bicycle. Rode in the shop and just rode away.
You?
Me, I bought a bicycle. Today.
Do you mind not flying your plane past while I'm shooting?